Today, an urgent bail-in update. Parliament is too stupid to be stupid. Hello again, I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined again by John Adams. Hello, John.
Hello, sir. How are you going?
Very good. Now, we're in the middle of a quite interesting discussion about a bail-in.
Yes.
And it seems to me that we should probably subscribe to the cock-up theory of history rather than the conspiracy theory of history based on what we've seen over the last few days.
Yes, indeed. So basically, after our last episode where we talked about, in terms of the bail-in question, there was one member there was an advisor within Parliament who works for what I would describe as a non-government senator, who basically, had a conversation with me and thought we were flogging a dead horse on the question of bail-in. Their view was that they had examined the legislation that passed Parliament in February. They considered the implications of what could be bailed in under Section 31 that we went through in the last episode, and they came to the judgment that deposits were completely safe and not at risk. And so even though we looked at certain provisions in the last episode, they thought that there were other provisions that we should have told the viewers, and that if we did, those provisions would give the average Australian, peace of mind in terms of their deposit. Now, and we'll go through that particular provision that this advisor asked me to go through. The issue is that when the advisor alerted me to this particular provision, and I started to ask the advisor certain questions about that provision, it was clear by his own answers that he didn't do his homework properly. And therefore, when he provided advice to the senator he was working for about what that senator should do with this legislation in terms of their position, the advice was incomplete. And because the advice was incomplete, I think that the senator and the senator's party voted without the full picture in terms of what they were actually voting for. So I think it's actually important to, and whether it's this advisor or other people in the community, whether it's APRA or the banks, etc. If people think that we are flogging a dead horse, I think it's we're both mature enough to listen to any criticism, mature and rational criticism, and then to consider the counter arguments of what we said in the last episode. So I did that. I examined what was said to me, and the person who thought I was flogging a dead horse actually didn't fully comprehend what the legislation was actually saying.
So the horse has got up and is now running again.
Exactly.
Right.
So the specific provision that this advisor suggested that we look at was what is now Section 11 CAB. So this was a part of Section 31. So Section 31 defined what a conversion and write-off was.
So this is in the APRA Act that they voted back in February, right?
Yes, this is the Financial Sector Legislation Amendment, Crisis Resolution Powers and Other Measures Act 2018. Yep. So Section 31 introduced the bail-in powers, what they call conversion and write-off provisions. But there was, and so what we did in the last episode was talk about the definition of conversion and write-off, and we talked about the possibility of converting additional Tier 1, 2 Tier capital or this language of any other instrument, and we basically said, well, that language is unclear. Now there is another provision in that broad section of the legislation that this advisor said we should be looking at, and so that is CAB. And basically, we'll put it up on the screen for viewers to have a read, but basically what that section says is, for an instrument to be bailed in, it has to have terms expressly defined to say that the instrument can be bailed in. So for example, when an investor invests in a hybrid security, as part of the prospectus, there are terms in the prospectus that makes it clear that the capital invested in that security could be converted into equity if the bank requires it to do so. So what this advisor said to me was that because of this particular legislation, because of this particular provision, they did not think that deposits were at risk because they thought that only investment products have these specific provisions of conversion and write-off. Now, when this was said to me, the first question I asked the advisor was, did you look at the contract, the terms and conditions of what a depositor has with a bank? So basically, for any of you who are watching this episode, if you go to a bank, you basically fill out 2 or 3 forms to establish an account with a bank, and the bank, because of what they are required to do, they'll provide you with a big document full of terms and conditions. And that terms and conditions are effectively the contract between you and the bank. So said to the advisor, did you check the terms and conditions of the deposit accounts with the various banks and credit unions, etc.? The answer was no. So that was the first issue. Now so exploring that for a second is, because they didn't check the contract, the terms and conditions. The first question is there any existing terms or conditions? Is there any bail-in or conversion or write-off provisions in these terms and conditions for these deposit accounts? Now, I did a bit of a search, and I know you did a bit of a search. So I think it's fair to say that at the moment, I couldn't, particularly with the big 4 banks, I couldn't find any explicit reference to defining a deposit as an instrument that can be converted or bailed in. Is that fair?
I agree, and I've looked at some of the smaller players as well, and there is no specific clause that says deposits can be bailed in. However,
yes,
it's a little bit, but there is this wonderful catch-all clause which pretty much all of the contracts have.
That's right.
Which is like the size of a huge double-deckered bus, right? Which basically says they can change anything they want, anytime they want.
Yes.
And even potentially make it retrospective.
Yes. And more importantly, they do not have to give the customer advance notice.
Yep.
So particularly, and we'll go through what the big 4, what the terms and conditions are for the big 4 banks. But particularly if the change is at the request of the regulator or government, they do not have to give advance notice to customers, and in some cases, all they really have to do is to put a notice in a major newspaper.
Yep.
So because of that, so I think to be as accurate as possible, the state of play given this section 11 CAB is that for an instrument to be bailed in, the terms and conditions or the contract or the prospectus of the instrument has to explicitly say this instrument can be converted or written off, when the circumstances allow, or if APRA provides a recapitalisation directive that we talked about in the last episode. So there's nothing there at the moment. But if the banks get into trouble, because of these clauses that we're about to go through in terms of the Big 4, they can change the deposit contracts at any moment without any due notice, without any forewarning of in terms of these deposit accounts. And then, so what it would be is the banks would, if they needed to bail in to ensure that the banks would survive, they would basically say that this deposit account has conversion or write-off power or properties, and then once those are then in the contract, it could happen in the middle of the night. APRA could then issue a recapitalisation directive and saying everything that has any instrument that has these provisions, you can then bail in, and because the bank has snuck them in without customers knowing, therefore it will be legal under the legislation.
And there's no set time limit or time elapse between announcement and making it happen, is there?
No. So I mean, you would think of what happened in the GFC. So the banks had some reasonable understanding of how much liquidity and how much capital they were hemorrhaging, and obviously they were communicating those sort of things in 2008 to APRA, the Reserve Bank, and to the government. So obviously that sort of communication is not known to the public, and so if APRA is aware that one of the Big 4 potentially may fall over, I mean they would go to the regulator and say, we are in trouble. We need capital very quickly, in terms of the existing capital structure, that's not enough to keep us afloat. What else can we do? It could be then put in the provisions into the deposit accounts, and then we'll issue the recapitalization directive, and therefore you can bail in to keep your bank open. Now, what was stunning to me was this advisor never checked the deposit accounts, never fully, he was stunned when I said, you do realize that the banks have clauses in these deposit account contracts that basically say they can change the term and conditions at any second without any notice, without any forewarning. And if they did that, then they would be compliant with this Section 11 CAB that this advisor thought was the security blanket for in terms of deposits.
Yep. So basically what we're saying is there is insufficient clarity still around the bail-in of deposits. It's still not clear.
Yes.
And the proposed solution, that clause that you mentioned, really makes no difference at all because of what's in the deposit account terms and conditions.
Yes.
Right.
So this is the first half of the title of the episode. Yep. Parliament is too stupid to be stupid.
Right.
Because you would think if you're going to be passing such consequential legislation that you would have serious. So this advisor looked at it for a few hours, but you think that you got to think really outside the box, and you got to really bring in. So obviously, there was a Senate inquiry, and having worked for a senator myself, I mean, the Senate inquiry process is very important because it allows the senators to flesh out issues because their job is to review legislation coming from the House of Reps. But even with the inquiry, the technical detail of these powers was not fully investigated by the committee. All the committee said was that the grassroots campaign led by the CEC was fraudulent. Treasury, APRA, Reserve Bank, government says that bail-in of deposits in this country is completely impossible. Therefore, nothing to see.
Right, and it's not that simple.
It is not that simple. So where to from here? So why don't we go through the specific clauses that I put out this afternoon from the big four banks about what they actually say in when it comes to their deposit accounts. So the first one I'll start with is Commonwealth Bank. So these are the terms, Section 17B of their cash deposit account. The terms and conditions talk about variation of terms and conditions. They say we may from time to time change any of these terms and conditions to adopt or implement any legal requirement, decision, recommendation, regulatory guidance, or standard of any court, tribunal, ombudsman service, or regulator. So I think for the Commonwealth Bank was when they say regulatory guidance from a regulator, well, that is not law. So that you don't need Parliament to pass a new law to make deposit accounts on the table. You just need a guidance note from APRA to say put these conversion right provisions in your cash deposit account, and therefore, and because of that, under the CBA contract, they can just do that, and they're compliant with their terms and conditions that the depositor agreed to upon establishing the account with the CBA. So that's the Commonwealth Bank. Now, in terms of NAB. So NAB, they have a terms and conditions for their personal transaction and saving products. Section 13.1 changes NAB may make. So basically, so they have a whole host of terms and conditions in the booklet, which is the terms and conditions of NAB. But then they say NAB may change any other terms and conditions, including by imposing new fees or charges, changing the amount, type or method of calculation of fees and charges payable. NAB will make any changes in accordance with the applicable legislation and industry codes. So when they say NAB may change any other terms or conditions, it says including these specific things, but it's not exclusive those things. So those changes of any other thing could be write-off or conversion provisions. And in terms of when it says will change in accordance with applicable legislation and in terms of industry codes, well, so obviously, when you think of in the middle of a crisis, well, what is the industry code? I mean, you've got to move quickly in order to save the industry. So again, no forewarning for customers if they decide to put in conversion and write-off provisions that are necessary to bail in to prop up NAB. Now, then we go to ANZ. So ANZ have terms and conditions for saving and transaction products. So Section 216 changes to fees, charges, interest rates, and these terms and conditions. So they say that type of change to any other condition, name of interest rates, accounts, or publications. Minimum notice period is day of the change. Method of notice in writing or in a major newspaper. So it could well be that past midnight, they basically say we're making the change. They put in their accounts, and they may have some sort of ad in the major newspaper that morning, but by the time the customer has read the newspaper, APRA may have already issued the recapitalisation directive. Therefore, bail-in happens, and ANZ has not breached its contract with depositors. Then we go to Westpac. So Westpac has terms and conditions for saving and transaction products, and basically what they define two types of changes for Westpac. So one is change to the how and when withdrawals may be made from the account, time frame on or in advance of the day of the change, method of notification in writing, electronically, or through media advertisement. So that is specifically about how you may have access to your money. They can do it on the day. So the other type of change which is relevant to our conversation from Westpac is change to any term or condition necessary or desirable to comply with or reflect any law, regulated guidance or requirement or decision of a court or other dispute resolution processes. Basically, they can make it in advance of the change or as soon as practically afterwards, unless the change has been publicised by a government agency, government or representative body. And again, method of notification is in writing, electronically, or through media advertisement. So again, just like you said with the small banks, the big four have these clauses that all depositors sign up to because these are standard terms and conditions. Therefore, that if the legislation requires that to bail in, there must be an express term to say that these deposit accounts are an instrument that can be converted or written off. They can just insert them when the crisis starts.
I guess it's worth saying we're not lawyers and we're not giving legal advice here, right?
That's right.
But this is pretty simple, straightforward stuff, isn't it?
Yes. And people in Parliament, when they pass this legislation, never check the deposit contracts to see whether, how this would work from an operational perspective.
Right. So it makes me ask the question, is this normal?
So before I went to Parliament to work for Senator Sinodinos, I did have this sort of grand notion that policymakers actually read the law that they pass and that they fully comprehend what they're voting for before they voted. Now, once you work for a politician, you realise that politicians. Well, one thing is Parliament passes way too much law. I think when I worked for the coalition in opposition, the Gillard government had passed a lot of laws, and even if you were taking your responsibilities as a senator seriously, there was just not enough time in the day to review every piece of legislation before the Senate and to do the Senate committee work and the question time and all the other responsibilities that a senator has. So the work volume, that is obviously large. Yeah. So unfortunately, one could say that this sort of thing, tends to be standard practice. Having said that, in this case, there was an advisor who I would say is very intelligent, very informed about this, and he's more cluey on this issue compared to most in the Senate, and yet he didn't even think about checking the deposit contracts. It could well be that everyone was honest. Bail-in was never intended to be for deposits. This was an oversight. Everyone was just stupid and just passed it, not knowing the full implications. Or, if you want to be conspiratorial, and we'll get to that in a second, it could well be that the government and the regulators and the Reserve Bank and Treasury had this intent all along, but didn't fully disclose their hand to the rest of the House of Reps and to the rest of the Senate. So why I say conspiracy, it's interesting. I get a phone call yesterday afternoon from a member of parliament, and for the purpose of this conversation, I would say it was a member of parliament from within the government, in terms of the backbench, and they had seen our previous episode, and I got the question specifically to say, do I personally think that the vagueness of the language in this clause about any other instrument? The question from the member of parliament was, did I think that was intentional or was that an oversight? Now, when I was asked that question, I had two reactions. The first one is I answered this question. I thought, no, I actually believe that it was intentional to write it that vaguely with no definition of instrument to give policymakers and the regulators full flexibility, depending on what may come up in the future. But on the other hand, the other sort of gut feeling I had was, each member of parliament, particularly on the backbench, are paid at least $200,000 a year, and their job is to write and pass the laws. And yet I have someone who's being paid $200,000 asking me what was the intent of the government, of the bureaucrats, when that was effectively his job. So yeah, because I didn't get a full appreciation from this member of parliament that they fully knew what the intent of the regulators were. So again, when you're getting members of parliament asking, people like me, what was the government's intent in passing this law, or what was the intent of APRA and the RBA and Treasury to write the law the way they did? I was kind of a little bit surprised, not surprised, just shocked to say that, well, I can answer your question and I can give you my best educated guess, but at the end of the day, that's your job. And if you're not reading the laws that the parliament passes, well then, you're abdicating your responsibility to the public.
So it comes back to this point about, is it cock up or is it conspiracy, right? And I'm still going with cock up. I still think that they probably didn't fully understand what actually was going on. Somebody might have. But the point is, we have law in the country at the moment which still potentially allows for the bail-in deposits. It's not completely excluded.
Exactly.
Only way to solve that would be to pass an amendment that specifically excluded deposits.
So you can do that, or to explicitly define what instrument means.
Yes. Okay. So then the challenge to the government is, why don't you do that? Take all this off the table. Take all of this noise off the table. Take all this concern off the table, and just make it crystal clear that deposits are excluded.
So that is the right answer. They should just do it to make it crystal clear. If I was a betting man, I would say they will not do it. And the fact that they won't do it, that opens up the thinking that there is a conspiracy. So I was just at Adelaide last weekend, and I spoke to an audience of about 50 people about my economic Armageddon thesis, everything I've been running for the last couple of years. And once we got to the Q&A, there were specific questions about politicians and parliament from the audience, and they wanted to know, are they that stupid, or is there systematic corruption and they're actually acting against the interests of the Australian people? Because you and I can pick this up. Now you're a banking expert, I'm not, but it's pretty obvious to do your due diligence and reading the law and understand and think about how the law actually works. But the fact that this law is getting through Parliament, at the same time, we know what happened in Cyprus. We know that deposits are on the table for New Zealand. We know that deposits are on the table for the European Union, as well as in the United States. And because the law passes and now the government won't do anything to clarify the legislation, people must think, well, they can't be that stupid in Canberra. Some sort of conspiracy is happening. There is certain powers that are at play. So out there in Voterland, this is what they're thinking. They cannot be that stupid. Therefore, there must be something. There must be a bigger, grander scheme, particularly driven by the G20 and the Financial Services Board, and we're a part of that international conspiracy. So that is the thinking out there.
Right. Okay. I just want to give you one other piece of information, and that is that following the bail-in episode that we did,
mm-hmm.
I got a very interesting comment from one of the people who watched it from New Zealand.
Yes.
And what the Reserve Bank in New Zealand has done has now actually put up a dashboard for all the banks in New Zealand with all the critical pieces of information about each bank, so that in New Zealand people are able to compare Bank 1 with Bank 2, Bank 3 and Bank 4. So that's something which wasn't there previously, but it now exists.
So what? So you're saying that the New Zealand Central Bank is putting up real-time capital information about the bank, so you can actually because at the end of the day, if you're going to judge whether your deposit is safe or not, you need to make an informed decision about the capital adequacy of each bank. So I mean, particularly just to give an example, earlier this year, when there was a lack of confidence in Turkey that they would be able to meet their foreign debt obligations, the Turkish lira fell 32% in 3 weeks. So I mean this I haven't seen the New Zealand thing, but is this information real time? Because
so it's roughly 3 monthly. So it sort of starts the journey, but you've just put your finger on what I was going to say, was that if people are now starting to rely on this information, right, it'll be out of date before you know it, right?
Precisely.
In which case, not only could it actually take people down a blind alley, but actually they could be almost accused of giving false information out if in fact the real information is not represented by what's in those rather historic pieces of information. So I think it really starts that slippery slope here.
Yes. And one of the things I presented on in Adelaide was not only to look at what happened with the Turkish lira earlier this year, but in the Asian financial crisis, when there was a lack of confidence that South Korea would be able to meet, their banks would be able to meet their international obligations, the South Korean currency fell 40% in 3 weeks. So again, I mean, a massive collapse in the currency has huge implications for the cost of capital for banks, and therefore, if the data is 3 months old, well, you can't make an accurate assessment in the midst of a crisis as to should I keep my money in the bank or should I be pulling it out.
Exactly. So once again, I think we have to conclude that bail-in is still a running sore.
Yes.
And certainly in Australia, it should be addressed through the question of defining deposits. But in New Zealand, I'm not even sure that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has taken the argument very far forward by actually providing all that additional information for people.
Indeed.
John, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
So there you have it. I'm afraid that bail-in is still a whole bunch of question marks. If you like what you've seen here today, please like the post, add a comment or question, we read them all. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so to receive updates on the latest posts. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.